All right, we are moving into our next module where we are talking about postmodern therapy. And within postmodern therapy, in the chapter, you're kind of introduced to some new terminology here, but the two kind of theoretical approaches that we're focusing on within this content module is our solution-focused brief therapy and narrative therapy. So again, kind of shifting into a different mindset, moving away from the more analytical type theoretical orientations and into some of the briefer modalities, if you will. So as I mentioned before, I practice from a solution-focused orientation whenever I was doing more clinical related work with adding in components of kind of social justice counseling along with the work that I was doing. But so this chapter is one that I love and I'm really excited about. And I hope you all love it too. But if you don't, that's fine. It's not for everybody, definitely not for everybody. But the concept of social constructionism is one that I especially am really I really have been focused in on from every aspect of my professional career, from using solution-focused theory as my theoretical orientation to taking a social constructionism approach to my teaching philosophy, which is a whole other theory that educators should be practicing. We should be providing education from some type of theoretical foundation, and my personal theoretical foundation for providing you all with education is social constructionism. And so I really gravitate towards this perspective as a whole in a lot of different aspects of the work that I do, even within supervision. So whenever I have to supervise students in practicum and internship, I take a social constructivist approach to my supervision as well. And so within this within these approaches, within the postmodern approaches and looking at social constructionism, we're really client with the space to be the expert on their own lives. And there's we're taking a backseat as an expert, even if we have all the knowledge, which I think takes some work on the part of the counselor to be open to whatever our clients bring to us, to be aware that our client's reality is their reality, and I can't and shouldn't be changing my client's reality. That their experiences are their experiences. And so whether we're looking at solution-focused therapy or narrative therapy, that is the kind of perspective the counselor is going to be taking. Client is the expert of their life. Within these postmodern approaches, and we'll talk about positive psychology more in depth in a couple of weeks, but there is a lot of connection to positive psychology, especially within solution-focused therapy. Very optimistic approach. I found that it worked well for me working with people with disabilities because the clients that I worked with had typically experienced a long period of time where they had been spoken to when their lives have been approached from a problem-oriented perspective. What diagnosis did they have? What were they not able to do? What were their limitations? What type of work could they not perform any longer? In what ways were they not able to do the things that they were able to do prior to an injury or prior to onset of illness or a cancer diagnosis? And so clients would come to me in such a state of being problem-oriented that that I personally didn't feel like I could do meaningful work in the amount of time that I was given, which was a short amount of time with my clients. I didn't feel like I could do meaningful work unless I switched that perspective for them, or helped switch that perspective with them, I should say, that even though there's all these problems, right, that we as a society typically focus on, we ask people, what's wrong, what's going on, what's bad in your life, tell me the bad and the negative. Switching from that mindset to, all right, I acknowledge that as an aspect of your life. Yes, please do tell me your story. I need to get a history about, where you came from, how you got to the point that you're sitting across the table from me. But let's shift the mindset into a more positive perspective, more strength-based, more what can you do, what has worked, what could work again in the future. And so within that, you have to allow the client to express their reality, to share their story, to share their perspective. But then as the counselor, you also have to recognize when you have enough, when you know enough about the client's background, to effectively move them, help them move in the right direction in terms of reaching whatever the therapeutic goals are that you're setting. So generating new meaning in the lives of clients is kind of what we're looking at when we're thinking about postmodern approaches, solution-focused narrative therapy, kind of from a social constructionism standpoint. Our clients come to us with a meaning that has been shaped by their experiences, by their lived experiences. It's their reality. And then we are gathering information, asking the right types of questions, and then helping clients to see a different way that their lives could look for them. And so there's kind of this development of alternative ways of being, an alternative way of acknowledging problems that might be present in their life, but taking the focus on things that could work, solutions that might be found. So again, just to kind of reiterate, if we're looking at the role of the counselor within postmodern approaches compared to the traditional therapeutic approaches, we're really looking at a collaborative, consultative type relationship, which again doesn't work for every client. There are clients out there that need to have somebody that's working with them who's a counselor that maybe does put on a little bit more of an expert hat. But within postmodern approaches, within solution-focused and narrative therapy, we're not the experts in our clients' lives. And I personally found value in that because within social constructionism, one of the kind of key concepts of it is that, we're always open to understanding somebody else's perception of reality. So from an education standpoint, there are 8 of you in the class, I think. Each of you is having a completely different and unique experience to the content I'm presenting in the lectures that I'm giving on a week-to-week basis in this particular class. And who am I to say that one student's experience is better or worse than another's? Who am I to say that you all should have the same experience in this class, or that I am doing such a phenomenal job that I could not improve in any way, shape, or form in the work that I'm doing, and I can't learn anything from any of you. The exact opposite is, comes into play with social constructionism. I learn so much from my students, and I have to be aware that each of your experiences are unique and different, and that they are meaningful to you, regardless of me, right? They're meaningful to you. Your experience is meaningful. And there has to be an acknowledgement of that, and a willingness to accept that I don't have all of the answers. And I don't expect to ever have all of the answers, really. And sometimes that is because things change and I still have to be doing work on my end to continue to improve the work that I'm doing, as every counselor does, right? We have to continue to develop competence. We have to continue to go through our continuing eds. We have to continue to improve. We have to be supervised. So the same goes for me, kind of from a social constructionism perspective. There's always room for improvement. But I might not know all the answers because I haven't been asked the question yet. And so, the questions that our clients bring to us, the concerns our clients bring to us, even if we have a client population that is relatively similar, okay, if we're working in like an inpatient mental health or behavioral health facility, maybe we do see a large number of clients that all have the same diagnosis, right? But from this perspective, you're understanding that each individual client's story is unique to them, their reality is unique to them, and the way that they express their reality is unique to that person as well. And we can never be an expert regardless of how long we work with the population. So I think that is one of those areas where this perspective is not for everybody. And, it's not for every counselor because you have to be humble to like the nth degree, I think. And, that can be tricky. That could be tricky, especially if you've been in it for a long time. So I'm going to try to go through the solution-focused brief therapy spiel with the same vigor as the narrative therapy spiel that I go through. But, you know, with solution-focused therapy, again, you're looking at problems that clients are bringing to us with the understanding that they're coming to us from a problem-oriented stance in their life, right? And so our job as a counselor is to shift that mindset, to acknowledge the problem-oriented stance, but also say, you know, there are things that can be going well. I'm sure there are examples of exceptions to when things were bad. You know, when were things working? What does that look like? Paint me the picture. Tell me what, in your wildest dreams, what the solution to this problem would be. So there is a lot of focus on the positive, on the strengths, what is working for a client. And, you know, the finding exceptions within somebody's stories takes a little bit of practice, right? Because we're really allowing through our active listening skills to pick up on those key little areas. And there are things that are unique about solution-focused brief therapy that, you know, again, may not work in every setting, but for me in rehab counseling, and this works pretty well in school counseling as well, you don't have all the time in the world. I didn't have all the time in the world. I didn't have set 50-minute sessions with clients, or the flexibility to go to an hour and a half if I needed to. Sometimes I would be working with a client for a longer amount of time, but I also didn't have all the time in the world. So I would never expect that my clients would be on my caseload for a year. That would not be realistic in my world, the places that I worked. So that's one of those kind of foundational aspects of solution-focused brief therapy, is that from the get-go, you're always focused on termination of the relationship. There's an expectation that I'm not going to be the counselor for this person forever, that we need to set some goals and we need to get moving quickly sooner rather than later, so very time limited. And within the work that's being done within that counselor-client relationship, the smallest little advances towards a goal are meaningful. And that might seem, you know, when you're thinking about little tiny things that might happen on a day-to-day basis for a client, little improvements in their life, it might seem arbitrary in the grander scheme of things. But in solution-focused counseling, and I think that's why it might work really well with adolescents, it worked really well for me with people with disabilities, because individuals get so used to not being able to see when little improvements have been made, when they were able to do something that they didn't think they could do, that sometimes clients expect kind of these grand changes in their lives, which eventually we hope people get to. But within solution-focused counseling, if somebody takes a little baby step towards a goal, that is something that is celebrated. And then the question is asked, how did you do it? How did it work out for you? How do you see that working for you in the future? So with solution-focused counseling, we're seeing future-oriented perspective. Yes, an acknowledgement of the past. For me, I would let my clients kind of start out by telling me their story, getting kind of the facts. And then whenever I got to a point where I felt like I had all the information that I needed, I would just be upfront with my clients and say, you know what? Thank you so much for sharing this story with me. I really think I've got a good idea of what's going on. How about we talk about how I can help you? How can I help you get to the goal that you want to get to? And so there was a little bit of like cutting off clients to a certain degree, because I didn't want my clients to stay in that problem-oriented world when they were working with me for the entire time of that day. Generally speaking, there's a belief that people can create their own solutions, or that they have in the past. And so a lot of the work is about finding when things have worked for people in the past. Have they dealt with a similar experience in the past and managed to push through it, managed to get through it, come out the other side? You know, trying to draw from people's past experiences, from their life stories that they've told us, and connecting that with the present and the future, even more importantly. So things that I'm just trying to go through here a little bit. Questions are pretty big in solution-focused counseling, but it's not just a question, like just arbitrary questions. We're not just asking questions for the sake of asking questions. The questions are a lot of like the how questions. How did you do that? How did you manage that? How do you see your life looking in the future? A confrontational one is kind of that, you know, when a client expresses something that didn't go well, you say, well, how did that work out for you? Knowing the answer is probably going to be, well, not well. So questions are meaningful, and they again are purposeful in that they're trying to highlight what works for that client, what has worked, and what could work again in the future. There is kind of this belief that change starts before that first session. And, you know, even for me, using using solution focused theory as kind of my guiding post to counseling, you know, yes, I believe that if somebody takes those steps to initiate a counseling relationship, then there's some work being done behind the scenes that I'm not aware of. But I think that, you know, for all problems to be resolved prior to even seeing a counselor, I think that, you know, those cases are probably fewer and far between in reality. But talking about that space whenever, because, you know, somebody could call a counselor, make an appointment, but it might not be for like 2 or 3 weeks down the road. So the very first time a counselor meets with somebody, they might be saying, all right, well, you know, you did the intake on, you know, October 1st, you know, here we are October 30th. What's been going on? You know, what have you done since you first made that appointment that makes the difference in the overall problem that you're presenting? You know, what things have changed between now and then? So there's an assumption that some work has been done, and a lot of work does get done outside of the counseling relationship. We know that. That's one of those things that comes through most theoretical approaches, is that there's some work being done outside of that session that you're in with your clients. So with this approach, it's just more of an emphasis on, you know, what can be done or what has been done within that shorter period of time. I mean, if we're talking about, you know, timelines for solution-focused therapy, you know, on average, I mean, people cite like that one session is enough with solution-focused therapy. Again, you know, yes, I think that, and I have had clients that have made significant progress within just one session and may not have felt like they needed to come back and talk to me about anything ever again. And I could assume that maybe things were resolved, and that was, you know, a major success on my part. Who knows? I think it can take more than that, realistically. But like I said, you know, if we're talking about how populations that this approach works really well with, you know, especially in school counselors aren't going to be working with an 8th grader for 5 years, right? And not even for a year, because they're not even seeing them over the summer. So it's very time limited that you might have a client on your caseload, and the amount of time that you can see somebody within a school setting, that you can see a student, again, very time limited. You know, you might only see a student in a school setting a handful of times. And so you have to utilize that time wisely, and you know, want to make sure that you're, again, just kind of focusing on the end, on the termination point. You know, can we get the client to where they want to be in their lives by the time that all of this is said and done? For me, on the rehab counseling disability side, again, people would not be on my caseload for a year. Only in rare circumstances, if I were supporting them through post-secondary education, would they be on a caseload. And then even then, they wouldn't be considered like actively on my caseload. So typically I would see clients for maybe like a month or so, with the expectation being that we were really kind of hitting the ground running and working towards that goal at a quicker rate, if you will. So you'll probably maybe now make some connections between some of the feedback that I've given on past videos about, you know, where's the goal? You know, when you're working with a client, I want to see the goal. When are we talking about the goals? So that comes from my perspective, and how I, you know, in my own approach to counseling, setting goals really quickly with my clients was a necessary part of the process, because, you know, with solution-focused counseling, you're just trying to always work towards those goals. And so if you don't have them, what are you working towards? Another aspect of this and again, you'll probably see that coming through some of the feedback, is taking time. And again, this is kind of the piece of the puzzle that's like a collaboration between the counselor and the client. Taking the time at the end of a session to really review what was done, review the work that was done, make sure that everybody's on the same page, make sure that I've interpreted things correctly, make sure that the goals that I think a client has set are accurate and reflect what they really want to be doing. And so that's part of me not taking an expert stance. That's not me saying, you know, this is what I want you to do, you know, complete steps A, B, and C before our next session next week. That's, you know, me recapping everything that we discussed and using what the client has said to kind of set the stage for what to expect in the next session. So, other things about solution-focused therapy. I think that's about it. So moving into narrative therapy. I always think of, whenever I think of narrative therapy, my mind just goes to, oh, storytelling. And to a degree, that's what we are talking about when we're thinking about narrative therapy, is allowing our clients to tell their story, to lay it all out, to present what has been going on in their lives to us, and then trying to figure out through all that what the problem is that's being stated, and then separating. This is kind of, I think, one of those bigger areas where narrative therapy would differ from solution-focused therapy. So in solution-focused, we've got, you know, probably problem-oriented versus solution-focused. In narrative therapy, we've got a person being separate from whatever their said problem is. And so in narrative therapy, clients will come to us kind of being intertwined with whatever their problem is. You know, problems that stem from childhood or adulthood or yesterday, wherever they might stem from. Typically a client will come in and just really associate closely with the problem, sometimes to the degree that they can't disassociate from it. They can't separate themselves from whatever that problem is. And so a big piece of narrative therapy is getting through the client's stories, practicing those active listening techniques, right? Practicing that empathy and encouragement to share stories, to share pieces of a person's life. And so being able to take from that, from all the information, and separate out what that person's particular stated problem is, whatever that message is that they've developed in their head. And then working with the client to help them be able to separate themselves from the problem. And so sometimes that means we're naming the problem. We're giving the problem its own space. We are, you know, I kind of think like I form pictures in my head, and I'm like forming a picture of actually like taking a problem and making it something, right? So within the therapeutic process, that's the first thing that's going to be done. And this is a collaborative process because, again, you got to have the client buy into this. You have to have the client on board and understanding that there's the problem is the problem, and they are a person, and the person is separate from the problem. And so then you can get into how messages have been received over time. You can get into how that problem, again, being separate from your client, has been disrupting their lives, and in what ways, and how can we continue to separate that problem and leave it in the past and leave it behind so the person can move on and say, goodbye, problem, we'll see you at no other time, hopefully. And so there can be kind of this process of looking for exceptions so that when the problem wasn't there, when it wasn't occurring, or when it wasn't dominating the client's life. I mean, I think that's probably one of the more realistic ways to think about looking for exceptions in terms of looking for exceptions to the problem. When was it not occurring? Because sometimes clients come to us and they've had issues that have been progressive or long-standing, and it's difficult for them to remember or think about a time when the problem wasn't there, whenever they weren't attached to it, but rather let's think about times whenever it wasn't in the forefront of that person's mind. And how would somebody want their future to look in the absence of said problem? And so that's where the movement comes in through narrative therapy, right? Helping clients kind of reshape what their future storyline is going to be. And within that, again, becomes the not knowing standpoint. the non-expert standpoint as the therapist, as the counselor. I don't know what my client's life should look like, right? None of us really know what our client's life should look like. And within narrative therapy, we're especially going to be aware of when that starts to seep in a little bit, whenever we have the expectation that our clients should or should not do this or that, but rather allowing them to guide the future of their new story, essentially. A lot of collaboration again in narrative therapy, a lot of the client taking the lead, and respect and being open on the part of the counselor to work with the client, kind of meet them where they are and help guide them where they want to go. So both of these approaches, all these approaches, really work nicely within group counseling settings, in short-term type therapy settings too. Again, remember, there's like a lot of places where, you know, group therapy might be limited to like 10 sessions. There's a lot of times whenever a client might come to us and our admin person, our lovely office administrative individual is going to be looking at their insurance and saying to us, all right, well, you've got 8 sessions that are covered through insurance, you know, and then it runs out. And so, you know, whenever you have when you're time limited with a client, for one, you're letting your client know that. And then you're really making use out of the amount of time that you have. Of course, working with the client if they need more time than that. But, you know, again, I think some of these shorter duration approaches work really nicely. Diversity, again, kind of flows nicely through all of this because we're not the expert. And so within that mentality of not being the expert, we're allowing our clients to tell us about their background, about their identity, about how that was shaped and formed and what that means to them. And I lost my train of thought, but there was something else I was going to say that had to do with time. Oh, maybe it'll come back. Darn it. It's gone. So again, I think that it's probably where I'll leave it. Oh, DSM diagnoses. That's what I was going to say, because that does tend to be a common question for you guys. And again, I'm just liking to answer questions I'm liking answering questions in the discussion board. I'm going to try to answer some of them in these lectures, because then it hopefully will spark you to be asking more difficult questions. Higher order of learning, right? So with using some of these most postmodern approaches and considering the DSM and diagnosis, I never interpreted from a solution-focused counseling perspective. I never interpreted kind of that the stance on acknowledging diagnoses or using diagnoses to guide the work that I was doing. I never thought it was as extreme as like brief therapy. You know, especially with my clients in the rehab counseling world, there was not a way that I could ignore a diagnosis, nor would I ever want to. A lot of the work that I did required me to acknowledge whatever the diagnosis was in order to help clients kind of shape more concrete, realistic goals. But there wasn't there wasn't a ton of focus on a diagnosis within the work that I was doing, and you know, from a solution-focused perspective. So it's not that solution-focused counselors look at the DSM and say, that's the worst thing in the world, we should not be using it, we should not be acknowledging it, forget a diagnosis, we can do the work outside of that. I think there is more of an acknowledgement of the purpose of a diagnosis, but we're not using that diagnosis to rigidly form goals, right? Because oftentimes, again, inherently within that diagnosis becomes kind of that problem orientation, right? What a person can't do, what their limitations are. And so that in and of itself is the opposite of what solution-focused counselors are going towards. We're looking at solutions. The diagnosis might come along with that, and that's part of it, and that's part of a person's story, but it's not something that, that we're overly focusing on. So, all right, I will leave you guys to the rest of the content within this week's module. And so in addition to the discussion, you have your third video. Oh my gosh, you're getting close to the end with those videos. I'm sure everybody's excited. And yeah, so I will just look forward to getting back into the discussions and seeing what questions you guys have. Have a great day.